All right, and we're live. And I know I promised this is probably the third time that I'm going to get back to the Quran, but I just thought I would do a short video on Black Friday. It's almost over, but so most people have probably got their shopping done. But I thought I'd do a Black Friday video addressing one of the arguments that was broached in a previous video about Islam having a billion people, and it can't be a ridiculous religion because it has a billion people. And there are a number of flaws in this argument, structural flaws, really self-evident flaws. First of all, it's an example of the agumentum ad populum, or the argument to popularity, or appeal to popularity. This is an argument which is based solely on popular support for a particular idea. So if you went back to the 12th century in Europe and you had made an argument for a heliocentric solar system, and you had argued that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but in fact, the Earth is merely one planet that revolves around the sun, they would have laughed at you and they would have cited all of the scholarly opinion of the time, or the general agreement among the public that the Earth was the center of the universe. In fact, there were even these maps, these astronomical maps, which put Earth at the center of the universe. So this is an argument that doesn't really work. It can be applied in certain limited circumstances. So in inductive logic, where the conclusion is based on the evidence gathered in the premises. So take, for example, a survey that found 95% or 100% of a large group preferred a certain brand of toothpaste. You polled 1,000 people, and 990 of them preferred Colgate. Then you could extrapolate from that the next person you talk to would use Colgate toothpaste. This is not an advertisement. I just realized it's probably going to be I know, just brand A. 90% prefer brand A. Then you could say, well, the next person would prefer that brand. So that's a case where the argument appeal to popularity would be considered valid. But in deductive reasoning, it has no basis. So to say, well, a large group, or even the majority, and the majority of people are not Muslim, it's at most 15% if you think that all of the 1.2 billion Muslims are actual Muslims who believe in that, which is something that I'll get to soon. But even that, to say, well, a large group of people believe this, therefore it's true, it's simply a logical fallacy. It's not a correct method of argumentation. So when Muslims bring this up as if it's some kind of trump card, they're just exposing their own ignorance. And you say, well, maybe it's not true, but there must be something to it. A billion people wouldn't believe that. But the truth is, it's not true. You have to actually examine the truth claims of Islam. And on that basis, and I've been doing a read through of the entire Quran and showing you, demonstrating how illogical, how riddled with error the Quran is, and how it's a ridiculous basis for belief. It's as ridiculous as Dianetics and Scientology, if not more so. It's as ridiculous as what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe, what the Branch Davidians believed. It's just as absurd as any of those other false religions or cults because Islam is just a gigantic cult. The thing is, a cult is not determined by how many people belong to it. So if 100 people believe in something, then that's a cult. But if 1 billion people believe in it, then it's not. That's not what defines a cult. A cult or a false gospel is defined by the error, the errors in doctrine, and the fallacious beliefs and the control. And that's something that Islam has in spades. But like I said, the argument appeal to popularity is simply a false. It's a logical fallacy for people who've taken logic and debate. And I've in school I took um, or even math class. Um, for anyone who's taken a basic algebra class, they should know this, that this is a logical fallacy. It's not a legitimate argument. But secondly, as I just said, the billion plus number, that's a bit of a fictitious number because it includes anyone who's born into a Muslim family, even if they don't believe any of the tenets of Islam. Like there was a woman talking to a friend on the ferry today about I don't believe I think it was her parents or her grandparents who were Muslim, but of course, the way she was talking, she obviously did not subscribe to any of this, but she would still be considered a Muslim, or people who report on the census that they're Muslim. Plus, you have to understand that Islam, takfir is integral to Islam, and it's something that Muhammad practiced, and that alone limits the ability to project some sort of unified Muslim caliphate. It's why even among jihadists you have ISIS and Al Qaeda, the the, the the same the same degree of hatred and barbarity, but even they can't agree on whether the other one is a Muslim. So even within that very narrow band within Islam, you have people who wouldn't consider the other group Muslim. Uh, Much less when you get into the divisions between Sunni and Shia. Shia, which make up 15 to 18% of the Muslim population, they're not considered Muslims uh, by most of the Muslim community, i.e., Sunnis. It's different in Western countries. There's more of a homogenization where even um, particularly in America, where even Ahmadiyya are considered Orthodox Muslims, or not Orthodox Muslims, but they're considered Muslims by other more Orthodox Muslims. But elsewhere, these people aren't considered Muslims by the prevailing dogma. So Sunni and Shia and Ahmadiyya, uh, there are people who don't consider Wahhabis Muslim. So to try to project that figure, 1 billion plus, as some sort of unified group that believes in the same doctrines and tenets. I mean, there are Ismaili Naziri Muslims. Now, these people don't even look to Muhammad so much as they look to the Aga Khan, who is a kind of jet-setting playboy who probably shares a lot. Now that I think about it, probably shares a lot of commonalities with Muhammad. He's basically divorced and jet-setting, but he's considered a guru or source of reverence, even more so than Muhammad, to the Ismaili Naziris. Now, there are people who don't consider them Muslims, and I'm sure they have problems with. Um, I'm sure there are people who have problems with the Ismaili Naziris. In fact, there's one country where they're trying to, where there's been a civil war between them and the government. But this is all to say that this idea of a billion Muslims is a really mythical fi- uh, figure. Not that there aren't a billion people who grew up in some community with some form of Islam, but the idea that it's some sort of monolithic group where each person within that community would consider another faction that believes different, uh, that has different dogmas, that they would consider them Muslim as well is simply not accurate. Um, so it also neglects this idea of the fastest growing religion. They repopulate because of reproduction, because Muhammad thought that women should be brood mares. He thought of them basically as cattle. So most of the women, particularly in third world countries, are forced to reproduce. And in fact, you hear imams in places like the West Bank or Gaza or Syria. You have footage of these people. Sometimes you see it on memory TV, like urging women to have more children and then to invade the West through emigration or hijra. So that's what the growth, to the extent that there's Muslim growth. But in terms of actual conversions, there are more Muslims, particularly now, rejecting Islam. A lot of them are becoming atheists, but a lot of them are actually deciding to follow Christ. There are more Muslims converting and deciding to become Christians than there are Westerners abandoning Christianity and following Islam, like Adam Gaddan, the Al Qaeda spokesperson from California, who was in the videos with Osama bin Laden. So it's a very misleading. It's kind of a misleading statement. It doesn't take into account the fact that you have entire nations like Iran, where the majority of the population has rejected Islam outright. They're forced to observe certain rituals in order to survive, but they basically corporately. There are certain nations like Iran that have never really accepted or embraced Islam and have rejected it. And if there were a democratic or free election, they would throw the mullahs out. Yeah, I mean there are political divisions within Islam too. It is because it's a very it's an ideology, much more than a religion. And Ayman al-Zawahiri, the deputy for Osama bin Laden, who's in charge of Al Qaeda now, ostensibly, he even made this point. And a good book to read is Raymond Ibrahim's Al Qaeda Reader. So he actually dissects the statements of Ayman al Zawahiri and the statements issued by Al Qaeda. And throughout, he admits that Islam, well, not admits, but he avers that Islam is an ideology more so than an actual religion. So it's something that something where politics and the institutionalization of um, certain behaviors and lifestyle and organization, basically the organization of society. That's what Islam is. It's not so much a belief in a particular version of God, because God or Allah in Islam is not that important. He's very remote. Even, I mean, people have said this 1,000 times, but it's accurate. Islam is a religion where you have a heaven without a God. It's much more important the political machinations, and this was true of Muhammad too. He was a warlord and a political leader more so than an actual spiritual guide, and his successors as well. The Rashidun Caliphate, the first four, rightly guided caliphs, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, all the way up through the Ottoman Empire. All of the centers of Islam were political, ideological institutions. So of course you had ideological divisions. That's how you have things like the Shia. The Shia are essentially a group of Muslims who disagreed with the path of Islam after Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, after his death. So they were called the partisans of Ali, and that set them up in opposition to what we now know as the Sunnis, or the people who followed Muawiyah, who inherited power, despite the fact that he wasn't he didn't have a relationship, a blood relationship to Muhammad. So the Sunni Shia is not is a religious it's it's a religious factional dispute, but it's more so political as well, or at least it started that way. It was basically a difference over politics. But again, I don't think, and now I'm just going to transition into the just wrap this up. Um, I don't think you can say, well, this has 1 billion people, therefore it's not absurd, or therefore its precepts aren't easily debunked, because it is. I've shown that over the course of the past 5 months how Islam literally, it doesn't make any sense. If the Mormons or the Seventh Day Adventists or the or Christian Scientists, if the Christian Scientists, instead of having 50,000 believers in their doctrine, had 50 million or 5 billion, that wouldn't make their beliefs any less heretical, any less absurd. It would still be a cult. And if Islam had instead of having hundreds of millions of believers in Muhammad, had and Allah had, 500,000 or 5 million, that still wouldn't change the the validity of their truth claims. Their truth claims would still be fallacious. They would still be erroneous. That's all I'm trying to get across. And it's not as if Islam is okay. To put this in perspective, the followers of Mani, who was a Persian prophet, believed uh, Manichaeism to be the religion of truth, and it was a form. It was a form of Gnosticism to a certain degree, but they basically believed in the philosophy of Mani, and this was popular from the 3rd century all the way up through the 7th or 8th century. So for hundreds of years, this was the primary, the biggest threat, quote unquote, to Christianity. And in fact, there after Christianity was made licit by the Roman Emperor, after Constantine, and after it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, there were laws against Manichaeism, and there were huge disputes. And for those of you who've read Augustine's Confessions, which is an amazing book, um, that's not true, Marshall. But for those of you who've read Confessions, which is a remarkable book, and I would suggest reading it, Augustine was not only an unbeliever, and people have probably heard the story about him. David Wood talked about this, how he had an epiphany thinking about him and his friends basically stealing from an apple tree. And and he realized he was stealing not because he needed to eat. He was stealing just for the thrill of doing something evil, and this kind of turned a switch in his brain. And later on, he was discipled by Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, and because of that, and his mother's prayer, his mother Monica's prayers, eventually he became a Christian and was baptized at the age of 31. And he wrote Confessions. And in Confessions, he describes how not only was he very wicked, but he also was into this really wicked belief system called Manichaeism. And the followers of Mani at the time, like I said, it lasted for around 5 centuries. At its height, it there were more people from a theistic perspective, and as a percentage, there were more that believed in that than believed in Islam at its apex. And the belief in Islam is declining because we actually have English language translations and translations. We have the internet. So the amount of people who actually believe in Islam, not simply the numbers of people who are born into Muslim families, is declining. Um, but like the percentage of people that believed in that, of theistic people who were theists, who believed in Manichaeism, was larger then at its height than the devout, real, genuine believers in Islam it was at its apex, like as a percentage of the global population. So I mean, there's no one, or there were very few people. I'm sure there were some real eccentrics who might do this, but there's no one today that would say Manichaeism is the truth, or it's valid, or it's not ridiculous, because at one point it was the second largest religion on the planet, and uh, Islam is nowhere near. Like I said, there somewhere between 13 or 15% of the population of the earth is Muslim. If you agree to just group all of these people who are raised in a Muslim home, even if they don't believe in it, plus all of these other groups that reject the the idea of rival sects being Muslim. If you just all group this huge blob of people with differing beliefs together and call them Muslim, it's maybe 13 or 14%. Oh, hi, GW. But but even that, it's like maximum 15%. The followers of Manichaeism, they comprised a much larger percentage of the population of theists during, like I said, from like around the third to yeah, I had a very good Thanksgiving. Thanks. It was really uh it was quite nice. But like the believers in Manichaeism, who followed Mani, as a percentage were much larger than the percentage of people who were devout, true Muslims at the apex of Islam. Now, the population of Muslims might grow in the future just because of population growth, but the actual number of Muslims, um, and the percentage of Muslims as of the global population is not uh, even as big as that of Mani, which is universally regarded as a false religion. And I don't think anyone would argue. Maybe there are some eccentric college professors who might, but no one would argue that, well, the followers of Mani, they were on to something, because there was such a large group of these people in the, from the third to eighth, seventh or eighth century. And someone can correct me. I know George is a history buff, so, but like I think that's the general time frame. And eventually, Manichaeism vanished, just like Gnosticism. Even though Gnosticism has had a revival of late because of people like Elaine Pagels and, like I said, these kind of wacky college professors who've tried to reinfuse to try to get you to believe that things like the epistle, the Gospel of Judas is, oh, the Gospel of Thomas, that these aren't ridiculous, even though when you actually examine them, they are ridiculous and they have no, just like comparing them to the actual canonical Gospels, you can tell that it's nonsense. Like, I think somewhere in the Gospel of Thomas, it says women um, have to become men to follow Jesus. I'm not sure of the exact phrasing, but it's ridiculous. And again, all of these things were ridiculous. But the thing is, Islam is no less ridiculous, and I just demonstrate that over the course of this video. Uh, yeah, no, I think it's encouraging when people reject a false religion, like the fact that there are huge revivals in Muslim nations like Indonesia and Malaysia and Iran. The fact that people are abandoning Islam in Iraq and Syria because they've seen it firsthand, the barbarity of Islam, and that there are Christians, there are many Kurds becoming Christians in places like Rojava, Syrian Kurdistan. I think this is something that you should be encouraged by because they're rejecting a false belief. I'm not saying that the fact that there are these revivals is proof that Christianity is true. I mean, there are many valid proofs for Christianity is true, but the fact that there are more Christians is not that's not a proof. I'm not using the agumentum ad populum in order to demonstrate the truth of Christianity. But yeah, no, I am encouraged. It is something that people should be encouraged by. Um, yeah, Ctesiphon, he was a Persian uh, quote unquote prophet. His followers believed he was a prophet. Um, but again, like when you actually examine the history of Hi First Corinthians, when you actually examine the history of Mani and the religion itself, just like Gnosticism, it's just very bizarre, and it's I guess it's appealing for people who, in an academic setting, like I mean, you could see why someone like Augustine would be attracted to this before he came to a saving knowledge of Christ. But it's when you actually look at it and and scrutinize it, it's kind of ridiculous. Just like Islam, that's the thing. When you actually read the Quran, you realize how absurd it is, which is why Muslims don't want you to read why you have to listen to it in Arabic. Yeah, in China, I think that was like the last holdout, but in the West, it pretty much, or what was known as the West, it by that point it was pretty much dead. Like I said, Augustine was a follower of Mani, and this was in the fourth century. He had rejected it after, I think, when he was 30 or 31, he was baptized. Uh, but yeah, so I just wanted to bring up that point. Like, you can't really use the fact that there are a lot of people that believe in nonsensical propositions as an argument for that nonsensical proposition. I mean, there are a lot of ridiculous things that people believe and that millions and millions of people believe. It's not just Islam. Like I said, there are tons of false religions that attract multitudes, and the fact that they can attract people, it may say something about the way the message is presented, but even that is not true in the case of Islam, because in Islam, a lot of the reason people remain in Islam is through fear. As I said, when we're going through these passages in the Quran, the aim of these passages was to instill a culture and a sense of fear in the people listening, the people following Muhammad, or people thinking about not following Muhammad. He called them hypocrites. these were Muslims who didn't agree with everything that Muhammad did. So he demonized them. So the main theme is just instilling fear. So even there, um, it's not that impressive when you think of the penalties for apostatizing in Islam. You could either be killed by your neighbors, you could be killed by your families in honor killings, and there are thousands of people who are killed by their Muslim families for rejecting Islam. Thousands and thousands of them killed every single year. Plus, you can be sentenced to death by the government. Depending upon the Islamic country, there are at least I'm trying to think of I think it's somewhere between 8 and 12 countries where capital punishment is imposed if you apostatize. So, and that's not including the other 40 odd countries, is predominantly Islamic countries that have either partial or full Sharia law and impose stiff penalties. So even if you're not killed by your neighbors or your family and not executed, you still have the threat of prison hanging over your head, where you may still be killed by Muslim prisoners. Um, but not only that, but the threat of being ostracized. Like I said, in my review of the Heart for Muslims conference, I met a man there who had lost most of his family, not all. There were still some family members who were associated with him, but he had been abandoned by most of his family. And this is very common. This was one of the fears of Nabil Qureshi. Even though his family didn't abandon him, it was still incredibly painful, the relationship after he was discovered to be a Christian and his parents found out that he had been baptized. So, I mean, even if you can put aside the threat of death and imprisonment and persecution, it's still a very weighty decision to reject Islam. You're abandoning you might be abandoned by your family. This was something the apostate prophet faced, and he did an entire video describing this process of going to Turkey and revealing. And this is a year or two after he had created this very popular YouTube channel, whose basic idea was to dissuade people from following Islam. Even though he had tens of thousands of viewers and subscribers, he still didn't have the heart to tell his parents because he realized it would really break their hearts. So you have to understand the motivation when you say, "Oh, all of these people are Muslim." The motivating factor is fear. If there was no fear, if you remove that element, Islam would be a probably a regional religion. I mean, it would be, it would be as popular as, say, the Seventh Day Adventism, which has, I think, like 20 million or 30 million followers, maybe like somewhere in that range. If you remove the element of fear, because it's not intellectually persuasive. There's not really a lot of confirmatory evidence for Islam. So if you remove the element of fear, it would be a very marginal religion where, yeah, it would have some followers, but it wouldn't be a threat. We wouldn't have countries rewriting their legal system and prosecuting people for speaking out or criticizing Islam. You wouldn't have people living in fear for their lives. So, I mean, I just this video went on a little longer than I expected, but I just wanted to get out those things to address some, because someone on the early stream had mentioned the fact that Islam has a lot of people. Therefore, the conclusion is it's not ridiculous. It is ridiculous, even if a lot of people um, decide to walk around nude in public. Say, like an entire town decides to do that, and you're the only one dressed. That doesn't mean you're the silly one. Yeah, Ben Carson is, I believe, a Seventh Day Adventist. Um, anyway, I just wanted to get that out. Happy Thanksgiving, a happy belated Thanksgiving to those of you who are watching. And I promise, I know I've said this 3 times before, but I promise now that this is done, the next video is definitely going to be on the Quran. And I think we're up to chapter, I don't even know what chapter, I think 52, the mountain, not the mountain from Game of Thrones, but another mountain. Anyway, thanks everyone. Like I said, feel free to share. Just anyone who's curious. I mean, the more people that watch this and find out the truth about Islam and get educated, I think it's great. Anyway, good night and have a good weekend.